On the 14th of February 1400, King Richard II of England was found dead in his cell. The official verdict was that he had refused to eat, but his skeleton, examined 800 years later, told a different story. And Richard was not alone. In the courts of medieval Europe, the most dangerous place a king could sit was at his own dinner table. Welcome to Veil of Europa, the dinner table in medieval Europe. It was the most political space in existence, not the battlefield, not the throne room, not the council chamber, the dinner table, because it was there in the act of eating together. That loyalty was displayed, that alliances were sealed, that trust was performed, and that enemies very often were eliminated. The medieval royal banquet was an elaborate theater of power. The king ate first. A servant called the taster ate before the king. The food was carried under armed guard from kitchen to table. Every dish was tested. Every wine was sniffed. Every ingredient was examined. Because everyone at that table, every lord, every ambassador, every trusted advisor, knew what the food could contain. Arsenic, lead, antimony, belladonna, aconite, substances that killed slowly enough to look like illness, fast enough to be convenient, in untraceable quantities, added by hands that smiled across the table. Tonight, we examine the most dangerous meals in European history, the banquets that ended dynasties, the cups that toppled kingdoms, the food that killed the people who were supposed to be most protected. We begin with a man who may have been starved to death in his own castle by his own cousin, who had just stolen his throne, and who needed him dead before anyone noticed. This is the darkest history of the European dinner table, and not a single word of it was on the menu. But before we examine the poisons themselves, we must understand why the medieval dinner table was so uniquely dangerous. Because it was not simply proximity to enemies that made it lethal. It was something far more insidious. Something built into the very structure of medieval court life that made poisoning not just possible, but almost impossible to prevent. The medieval royal court was a closed system. Everyone who mattered lived there, ate there, slept there, competed there, for position, for the king's ear, for land, for money, for survival. And in this closed system, food was power. Who sat closest to the king at dinner was a measure of political standing. Who was invited to the king's private table was a statement of alliance. Who was publicly excluded from the royal feast was a public humiliation. The food itself carried political meaning at every level. Spices, pepper, saffron, cinnamon were worth more than gold by weight. Serving spice food was a display of wealth. Receiving it was an honor. The elaborate subtleties, sugar sculptures in the shape of castles and animals, were statements of artistic and financial power. But beneath all of this theater, beneath the roasted swans, the gilded peacocks, the wine flowing from fountains, ran a current of mortal anxiety, because everyone at that table knew that the food could be used against them. The position of royal taster was not ceremonial. It was the most dangerous job at court. A man, or sometimes a woman, whose entire purpose was to eat before the king, to absorb whatever was in the food, before it reached the royal mouth. Records survive of tasters who died. Suddenly, at table, mid-meal, their deaths recorded in court documents with clinical brevity. The taster fell ill after the first course. The king was served from a different dish. The taster did not recover. But the taster system had a fundamental weakness. It could only detect poisons that worked quickly. The most sophisticated poisoners of medieval Europe did not use fast poisons. They used slow ones. Arsenic, the king of poisons, administered in small doses over weeks or months, producing symptoms that mimicked the most common illnesses of the era: stomach ailments, hair loss, weakness, confusion. The slow accumulation of white arsenic in the body, undetectable by any taster, undetectable by any physician of the era, undetectable by anyone, until modern forensic toxicology, applied to long-dead bones, began to find what the medieval world could not: the slow murders, hidden in plain sight, at every royal table in Europe. For centuries, And the first case we examine is one that changed the history of England forever. A king removed from his throne, imprisoned in his own castle, and found dead in circumstances so suspicious that historians have never fully agreed on what actually happened, until his bones were tested. And the results were not what anyone expected. Richard II of England was deposed in 1399 by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned at Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, and on the 14th of February 1400, he was found dead. He was 33 years old. The official account said he had refused food, had starved himself, in grief, in despair, after losing his crown. Contemporary chronicles described him wasting away, refusing all nourishment, his body found thin and broken. Henry IV accepted this version, publicized it, had Richard's body displayed publicly in London to prove he had died of natural, if self-inflicted, causes. And for 600 years, that was a story, a deposed king, broken by loss, who chose death over captivity. And then in 2012, a team of forensic scientists examined the remains and found something in the bones. That changed everything. The levels of lead in Richard's skeleton were extraordinarily high, not the elevated lead levels of someone who had lived in a medieval environment where lead was present in cookware, in pipes, in paint, but significantly higher. Consistent with chronic lead poisoning, administered over time, the researchers were careful. They did not claim Richard was murdered. They noted that the evidence was consistent with slow poisoning. They noted that it was also consistent with other explanations. But here is what the official story does not explain. Richard was a prisoner. His food came from one source. His captors controlled everything he ate and drank. Henry IV had every reason to want him dead. A living deposed king was a permanent focus for rebellion, a permanent challenge to Henry's legitimacy. Dead. Richard was no longer a threat. Was Richard II murdered by slow lead poisoning? Or did he genuinely refuse food and waste away? The bones suggest the first. The official record insists on the second. And Henry IV, the man who controlled Richard's food supply, the man who benefited most from his death, ruled for another 13 years. As King of England, never charged, never questioned, never held accountable for the death of the cousin he had replaced. At the dinner table of history, he served himself, and Richard paid the bill. Richard II may have been poisoned slowly, but the next case we examined was different. It happened at a single meal, in a single night, and it did not just kill one king. It killed an entire generation of Scottish nobility, in what became known as the most treacherous dinner invitation in the history of the British Isles. Edinburgh Castle, November the 24th, 1440. The young King James II of Scotland was 10 years old. He had been king since the age of 6. After his father James I was assassinated, stabbed 28 times, in a sewer by nobles who had decided he had become inconvenient. Scotland in 1440 was not a stable country. It was a kingdom of competing noble families, each one more powerful in their own territory than the child king on his throne. The most powerful of these families were the Douglases. William Douglas, the 6th Earl of Douglas, was 16 years old. His little brother David was 14, and together, the Douglas brothers represented a threat, not because of anything they had done, but because of what they might do, because of what their family name meant, because of the armies their name could raise, and because of the men who controlled the young king, Sir William Crichton, the Lord Chancellor of Scotland, and Sir Alexander Livingston, who between them held the real power in Scotland, and who had decided that the Douglas brothers needed to be removed. They sent an invitation to William and David Douglas to dine with the king. At Edinburgh Castle, the brothers accepted. They were escorted into the great hall, where the young King James sat at the high table. The food was served, the wine was poured, and then, at some point during the meal, the kitchen staff brought in something that was not food, a black bull's head, carried on a platter, and placed on the table, in front of the Douglas brothers. In the symbolism of medieval Scotland, a black bull's head at the dinner table meant one thing: death. It was a sentence, delivered over the soup course. The Douglas brothers understood immediately. William reportedly tried to appeal to the 10-year-old king, who was weeping, because even he understood what was happening, what he could not stop. Both brothers were dragged from the hall, given a brief mock trial in the courtyard, and beheaded that same evening. The Black Dinner, as it became known, was not technically a poisoning. No substance was added to the food, but the dinner table was still the weapon. The invitation to eat was a trap. The ritual of the shared meal was the mechanism of murder. The food was a lie that brought the Douglas brothers within reach of the men who wanted them dead. The young king never forgot what he witnessed. Years later, when James II was old enough to rule, he would pursue the Douglas family relentlessly, and in 1452, he would personally stab William Douglas VIII Earl at another dinner in another castle after another invitation. The dinner table in Scotland was a place of extraordinary danger for anyone named Douglas. The Black Dinner killed with a symbol, but the Medicis of Florence killed with something far more sophisticated, because Florence in the 15th and 16th centuries was not simply the center of the Renaissance. It was also the center of something darker, a city where poison was an art form, and where the most powerful family in Europe became the most feared dinner hosts on the continent. The Medici family of Florence, bankers, patrons of the arts, supporters of Michelangelo, of Leonardo, of Botticelli, the family that funded the Renaissance, also maintained, according to contemporary accounts and the testimony of their enemies, what was essentially a school of poisoners. Catherine de' Medici, who married Henry II of France in 1533, and who brought with her from Florence a retinue of Italian servants, among whom her enemies claimed were perfumers, who were also poisoners. The perfume was a delivery mechanism, gloves scented with poisonous substances that absorbed through the skin, books with poison pages that were touched and touched again, slowly, over weeks, until the reader fell ill. Whether these specific methods were real or Protestant propaganda designed to discredit the Catholic Italian queen is debated. But what is not debated is what happened to the people around Catherine de' Medici. Her husband Henry II died in a jousting accident. Her son Francis II died at 17. Her son Charles IX died at 23. Her son-in-law, the King of Navarre, nearly died of what contemporaries described as a mysterious illness, and Catherine outlived all of them, to the age of 69, in a court where death came regularly. For everyone except her, the accusation of poison followed the Medicis everywhere, and not without reason, because Florence in this era had a specific reputation for specific expertise. The acqua tofana, a clear, odorless liquid, developed in Italy, used primarily by women to eliminate inconvenient husbands, made from arsenic, lead, and belladonna, administered in wine or water, a few drops at a time, over months, producing symptoms indistinguishable from natural illness. The woman most associated with acqua tofana, Giulia Tofana, is estimated to have sold her product to over 600 women between approximately 1630 and 1651. 600, over 20 years, in a single Italian city, before she was caught, tortured, and executed, along with her daughter and several associates. But here is what the historical record of acqua tofana tells us. It was not remarkable, not extraordinary, not a unique criminal enterprise. It was a business that operated for 20 years, in plain sight, serving hundreds of customers, because the demand was there, because women in early modern Europe had almost no legal recourse against violent or abusive husbands, because inheritance laws trapped women in marriages that were destroying them, because poison was the only weapon available to people who had no other weapons. The Medici reputation for poison, the 600 customers of Giulia Tofana, tell us something important, not just about the killers, but about the world that made killing the most rational option available to people who had no other choice. The Medici's poisoned for power, Giulia Tofana's customers poisoned for survival. But the next case we examine is different from both. because it involves not a deliberate murder, but something almost more disturbing. An entire court that was poisoning itself, slowly, unknowingly, with every meal it ate. And the substance that was killing them was not a weapon. It was medicine, the most pervasive poison in medieval and early modern European royal courts. Was not administered by enemies. It was administered by physicians, by cooks, by the royals themselves, in the form of medicine. Lead was everywhere in medieval Europe. Cooking vessels, water pipes, wine vessels, pewter plates, and cups. The sweet taste of lead acetate, lead sugar, was used to sweeten wine, to preserve it, to improve its flavor. Roman emperors had drunk wine sweetened with lead for centuries. Medieval European courts continued the practice, unknowingly poisoning themselves at every meal, over every lifetime. But lead was also medicine. Physicians of the medieval and early modern era prescribed lead compounds for skin conditions, digestive problems, infections, pain, the face paint of aristocratic women. The fashionable white complexion that signaled high birth was made of white lead, ceruse, applied daily, absorbed through the skin, over years, producing exactly the symptoms of lead poisoning: weakness, confusion, premature aging, and eventually, death. Mary, Queen of Scots, whose symptoms throughout her imprisonment included chronic pain, weakness, vomiting, and partial paralysis, has been analyzed by modern researchers who found elevated levels of lead in her hair samples, consistent with chronic lead exposure, from her medicine, from her food, from the cosmetics she used, from the pewter vessels she drank from. Charles II of England, who died in 1685 after a sudden collapse, had been treating a kidney condition for years, with remedies that included antimony, mercury, and lead. His physicians killed him while trying to save him. George III of England, whose periodic bouts of madness destabilized the British government, have been attributed by researchers to arsenic poisoning from the medicine prescribed for his skin condition. The arsenic, over years, built up in his system and produced episodes of confusion, agitation, and apparent lunacy that were in fact the symptoms of a slow chemical poisoning administered by royal physicians who believed they were helping their king. And perhaps the most extraordinary case, Napoleon Bonaparte, exiled to St. Helena, dying slowly, his hair analyzed after death, showing arsenic levels 15 times the normal. Was he poisoned by his British captors? Or was he, like so many before him, poisoned by his own wallpaper? The green wallpaper of St. Helena, which contained copper arsenite, and which, in the damp climate of the island, produced arsenic gas that he breathed every night in his sleep. The most dangerous meals in European royal history were not always served at the table. Sometimes they came through the walls, in the air, in the medicine, in the face paint, in the pewter cup that the king lifted every morning without knowing that every sip was shortening his life. The involuntary poisonings are disturbing enough, but the deliberate ones, the calculated, planned, politically motivated poisonings of medieval Europe, tell us something specific about how power worked and how it was taken. And we end tonight with the most audacious poisoning attempt in the history of a European dinner table. One that almost worked, that targeted not one king, but many, and whose perpetrator walked free for reasons that reveal exactly how political murder functioned in Renaissance Europe. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, the same year Columbus reached America, the same year the Spanish Inquisition expelled the Jews from Spain, and the same year that one of the most dangerous dynasties in European history took control of the most powerful religious office on earth. The Borgias were Spanish, transplanted to Rome, operating in an Italian world that viewed them with a mixture of fear and contempt, foreign, ambitious, ruthless in ways that shocked even the ruthless politics of Renaissance Rome. Pope Alexander's son, Cesare Borgia, was the model for Machiavelli's prince, not as a criticism, as a compliment. Cesare was everything Machiavelli admired: intelligent, decisive, completely without scruple, and contemporaries believed the most accomplished poisoner in Europe, The Borgia weapon was called cantarella. Its exact composition is unknown. Contemporary accounts suggest arsenic, possibly combined with phosphorus, possibly with other substances, administered in food, in wine, in the Eucharist, in the communion wine served at papal masses. Whether the last of these is literal or anti-Borgia propaganda is debatable. What is not debatable is the pattern of deaths around the Borgias. Cardinal Orsini, dead shortly after a dinner at the Vatican. Cardinal Michiel, dead shortly after drinking with Cesare Borgia. The Bishop of Calahorra, dead after a papal audience. All of them leaving estates that were immediately seized by the Vatican. Under Pope Alexander VI, the pattern was noted at the time by contemporaries, who began to decline dinner invitations from the Borgias with elaborate excuses. But the most extraordinary Borgia poisoning story is the one that went wrong. In August 1503, Pope Alexander VI and Cesare Borgia were both taken violently ill on the same day, after the same dinner. The most common explanation, accepted by most historians, is that they contracted malaria, which was endemic in Rome in the summer. But contemporaries had another explanation, that the Borgias had prepared poisoned wine for the other guests at the dinner, and that through a mix-up of bottles, they had drunk it themselves. Pope Alexander VI died 12 days later. Cesare Borgia survived, but was so weakened that he never recovered his political power. The Borgia era in Rome ended with what may have been the most poetically just accident in the history of political murder: the poisoners, possibly drinking their own poison by mistake in their own dining room, at their own table. Whether this version of events is true remains disputed, but it has endured because it satisfies something fundamental about our need for justice in a world where the Borgias, despite everything they did, were never tried, never convicted, never punished for any of it. The pattern of deaths around them, the seized estates, the poisoned cardinals, the terrified dinner guests, none of it was enough in Renaissance Rome to bring down a pope and his son, who had made the dinner table the most dangerous place in Europe. The medieval dinner table was never simply a place to eat. It was a stage where power was performed, where alliances were made, where trust was displayed, and where, with enough patience and the right substance, enemies were eliminated. Richard II, possibly killed by the man who controlled his food, the Douglas brothers, invited to dinner and executed before dessert. Catherine de' Medici, surrounded by death, surviving everyone, in a court full of poison. The royal physicians, who prescribed mercury and arsenic and lead, in the genuine belief they were helping, and the Borgias, who possibly drank their own poison at their own table by mistake. The dinner table of medieval Europe was the most dangerous room in the most dangerous buildings in the world, and the food that was served there, beautiful, elaborate, spiced, gilded, was sometimes the last thing that the most powerful people on earth would ever taste. The history of royal poisoning is not simply a history of murder. It is a history of power, of what people will do to take it, to keep it, to protect it, and of how the most sophisticated political systems in human history could be undone by something as simple as what was in the cup. Subscribe to Veil of Europa. Every week, we find the darkness that history hid in plain sight. We'll see you in the shadows